Around the year 100 BC, Julius Caesar needed to send secret military plans to his generals in the field. The problem was that if these messages were intercepted by the enemies will be able to read them and expose Caesar's plans and strategies. Julius Caesar needed a way to prevent his enemies from reading these messages even if these messages were intercepted. Only his generals should be able to read these messages under any circumstances. Caesar kept looking for a while until one day one of his men claimed to have found a way to make Caesar's messages unreadable to the enemies and yet readable to the military generals. He suggested that if they move each original letter in Caesar's message 3 letters down the alphabet, the original message will be turned into a cipher, and this cipher text is what the enemies would see instead of the original message. So for example, if Caesar's messages were written in English alphabet, each letter A in the message would turn to a D, and each letter B would turn to an E, and so on. So if Caesar needed to send the word attack to one of his generals, this is how it would look like to the enemy. Not only that Julius Caesar succeeded to achieve confidentiality and protect his messages using the shift cipher, but also he founded one of the earliest encryption methods known to us in history. My name is Islam Baha, and today we are going to talk more about confidentiality and encryption. So let's go! As we learned in the previous video, confidentiality is one of 3 pillars of the SSL protocol. Confidentiality aims to protect the transferred information by ensuring that it is only readable to the sender and the receiver and no one else. And however, unlike Caesar's times, we do not send the information on horses anymore. We use wires and networks. Yet, the security threats stays the same. A man in the middle can intercept our information, read it, and use it to cause harm. And that's why the SSL protocol will use encryption to protect our data and achieve confidentiality. We usually refer to the messages before encryption as plain text, and after encryption we refer to them as ciphertext. And process of encryption itself is very simple. Basically, we have a mathematical function that gets the plain text as input and gets out the ciphertext as an output. The sender of the information will use this mathematical equation to encrypt the data, turn it from a plain text to a ciphertext, while the receiver will apply the same mathematical equation in reverse to transform it from a ciphertext into a plain text. What the receiver just did is called decryption, and the decryption is the opposite of encryption. While the sender encrypts the message before sending it, the recipient will decrypt the message in order to be able to read it in a plain text. However, that the shift cipher encryption sounds brilliant, exactly what Caesar was looking for, Caesar still has another problem. Caesar was thinking, what if one of his generals decided to betray him and explain to the enemies how the shift cipher encryption mechanism is working? In that case, the messages of Caesar would still be exposed and his plans and strategies will be known to the enemies. Again, Caesar needed to find a way to make this encryption specific to every general. So if one general decided to betray him, the messages between Caesar and the other generals are not exposed. To truly achieve confidentiality, Caesar will have to find a way to make a unique encryption method between himself and each of his generals. So if one general decided to betray Caesar, the messages between Caesar and the other generals are not exposed. This task is fairly complex, but fortunately we are not the first person to think of this problem. In the 16th century, a French diplomat and a cryptographer called Blaise de Vigenère decided that the shift cipher is not strong enough, and he dedicated himself to find a better encryption method. After a little bit of time, Vigenère actually managed to find a better way of encryption, an advanced way that was considered unbreakable for centuries. Vigenère's cipher or polyalphabetic cipher will add a new factor to the mathematical equation of encryption, a pre-shared key. Each of the generals will have a unique pre-shared key for the communication with Caesar. Now, even if Caesar is using the same exact encryption mechanism to communicate with all of his generals, only the general with the correct pre-shared key, which was used to encrypt the message, will be able to decrypt it and read it. So for example, if Caesar needed to send a message to Octavius using the shift cipher technique, and the pre-shared key between Caesar and Octavius, let's say, is the number 3. In that case, we will move each letter 6 letters down the alphabet, and this is how the word attack will look like after encryption. On the other hand, if Caesar needed to send the exact word attack to Darius with a pre-shared key of 5, so each letter in the word attack will need to move 8 letters down the alphabet, and this is how it will look like after encryption. As you can see, changing the keyword changes how the ciphertext will look like. Using a pre-shared key in encryption was a milestone that we are still benefiting from until today. In the modern day, we call it key-based encryption. But don't forget that with key-based encryption, we still have a big problem. If someone somehow managed to acquire the pre-shared key, they will be able to decrypt the message and read it. The Cryptography Society was aware of this problem, and they worked for years to improve the key-based encryption, until it evolved to 2 different types of key-based encryption: symmetric key-based encryption and asymmetric key-based encryption. The symmetric key-based encryption is pretty much the same as Vigenère's methods. Basically, we will exchange a pre-shared key over the wire and use the same key to encrypt and decrypt the message. The asymmetric encryption, on the other hand, is using 2 different keys. One key to encrypt the message and another key to decrypt it. The key we use for encryption is called public key, and the key we used for decryption we call private key. And the golden rule of asymmetric encryption is whatever is encrypted using a certain public key can only be decrypted using its private key. Let's see how that works. Let's say that Caesar and Octavius needed to exchange information using asymmetric encryption. The first thing they will need to do that each of them will need to generate locally a public and a private key. So Caesar will have his own public and private key, and Octavius will have his own private and public key. The second step is to exchange public keys over the wire. So now Caesar has Octavius' public key and Octavius has Caesar's public key. Now, whenever Octavius needs to send any message to Caesar, he will encrypt it using Caesar's public key. And when the message is received, Caesar will use his own private key to decrypt the message. And vice versa. If Caesar needed to send a message to Octavius, Caesar will have to encrypt the message using Octavius' public key, and when Octavius receives the message, he is the only one with the private key that can decrypt this message. And even if a man in the middle acquired the message and the public keys, the messages cannot be decrypted using public keys. Only private keys can decrypt the message. It sounds like the asymmetric encryption solves all Caesar's problems. Now Caesar can send messages to all his generals securely. Each of the generals will have a pre-shared key with Caesar, no problem. And even if these pre-shared keys got acquired by the enemy, they will not be able to do anything with it because only the private keys can decrypt the messages, and the private keys were never communicated over the wire. The asymmetric encryption still has its own limitation that makes it impractical for us to use in our daily applications. For example, if we need to send big files over the internet or over the network using the asymmetric encryption, this will take a long time and very high CPU processing. On the other hand, the symmetric encryption is perfect to send large sets of data because it is very simple, so it is very efficient time-wise and CPU power-wise. If only we have an encryption method that is as efficient as the symmetric encryption and as secure as the asymmetric encryption. Is there a way to bring the best of both worlds and come up with the best encryption method? To answer this question, stay tuned. I'll see you in the next video.